Good morning and welcome to this and our continuing series of webinars about the NUCA system of care. Today we're going to be talking about compassion, fatigue, and burnout and the role that that plays in those of us in the helping and healing professions. My name is Gil Prickett and I'll be your moderator today. Our presenters today are Bob Cheney and KJ Warby. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is KJ. I've been with SCF now for 21 years, and actually Bob and I have worked together all of that time. Bob used to be my internship supervisor way back in 1995, so we've enjoyed a long period of time together.
Go ahead and tell them the rest of it.
I'm not going to.
And now she's my supervisor. So Bob Cheney here. I'm the Director of Employee and Community Assistance. I provide assistance to our staff. I do other things as well. I've been with SCF for, I think, 24 years, and I'm not sure, and I really don't want to know exactly because I lost count. So.
Great. Thank you, guys. My name is Gil Prickett. I am a Learning and Development Clinical Advisor in our Development Center here at SCF. I have been with SCF for a little over 13 years. Most of that time was actually spent in primary care as a behavioral health consultant and a clinical supervisor. So most of my time here has been in a clinical role. So I think that one of the things that as we were preparing for this webinar is we could all identify from our own professional experiences times when we've experienced compassion fatigue and burnout and the impact that has on us. So this is stuff that's very familiar to us, and hopefully from our experience and from the things we share with you today, there'll be some things that you'll find helpful and that you'll be able to utilize in your own work. We do have somebody available for technical support today, so if you have any concerns or any issues with MediaSite, which is the platform that you're watching us on right now, any connectivity or challenges around that, please contact Luke Benson Carlo. He's our technology specialist here in the Learning Institute. And the easiest way probably to contact him is via text at 907-268-7078. And he'll be able to assist with any concerns you may have around that. So as I mentioned, we're using MediaSite. MediaSite is the platform we use to deliver these webinars. And one of the things that we can use with MediaSite is a little Q&A functionality. As the moderator, you see I've got a computer here in front of me. I have the ability to respond to questions if you send them to me. And to send a question to me, you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner of your web browser screen, there's a little speech bubble. That's the Ask a Question icon. So you would click on that Ask a Question icon. When you do that, it pops up a dialog box where you could fill in your name, your subject and message, and click Ask a Question. Make sure to include your email address on that. That way I will be able to respond accordingly. And if you want to practice that right now, feel free to do so. Send me a question and I will respond. Another tool that we're using in order to get some interactivity with our audience and to find out who's out there and to kind of get a sense of some of the information that you might find helpful is something called Mentimeter. Mentimeter is a polling app that we can use that you actually can use just from your cell phone. What I'm going to ask you to do right now just to practice this is go to www.menti.com and use the code 805470. And we'll be using that same code throughout the presentation. But if you could go to menti.com and using that code 805470 and share your name and your role in your organization. And we're going to see who's here with us today. So we have Lori, who's a program coordinator. Thank you, Lori, for joining us today. We're really glad you're here with us. Jessica, an RN. Great. Really glad to have you joining us today, Jessica. What I'm really hoping is that we have people in lots of different positions because I think compassion fatigue impacts all of us in one way, shape, or form. Tanya, who's in communications. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya, for being here with us today. I love this that we have a variety of people joining us.
I do as well.
Let's see, Gregory,
Oh, great.
who's a behavioral health technician.
Great.
Shanta, am I reading? Shantae, psychometrician in the FASD clinic. Wonderful. Whitney, program coordinator in pediatrics.
Great.
Beth and Amanda, they're New Talk nurses.
Great.
Colleen, who's a nurse in behavioral health. Michael, who's a voting member for a charity organization. That's great. This is great. And so I really am glad that we have folks from across different positions and different roles in the organization. I think that it's really helpful to see that this is something, compassion, fatigue, and burnout is something that can affect all of us regardless of what role we're in. So just as a reminder about who we are as an organization here at South Central Foundation, our vision is a Native community that enjoys physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual wellness. And our mission is to work together with the Native community to achieve wellness through health and related services. Our goals as an organization are shared responsibility, a commitment to quality, and family wellness. And you see that spells out SCF because that really does inform who we are as an organization. One of the key fundamental principles of work here at SCF is customer ownership. The people who receive our services aren't patients, they're not clients, they're not just customers, they're not just owners, they're customer owners. So we provide service to them, but they own their health care. Mm-hmm. And that really does inform a lot of the ways in which we approach things. And I think it adds to why we want to take an issue like compassion fatigue so seriously, because we want to make sure that the service we're providing to our customer owners is of the highest quality.
I agree. There's something very different in terms of relationship, providing care to a patient, I think, versus a customer. It changes the dynamics of that relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. Our operational principles, which I won't read all of these to you right now, but our operational principles spell out relationships. Relationships are really foundational to the way we do business here at South Central Foundation. And our core concepts are wellness. We really want to promote wellness for everybody involved with SCF, and that includes our employees and staff. And that's another reason why we think it's so important to talk about compassion fatigue. Core Concepts is also the name that we use for a training that we do with all employees who experience that usually within the first 6 months to a year that they're here. It's a 3-day training that all employees attend. We'll be talking about that a little bit more later in the training because we'll be referencing some tools that we learn through Core Concepts and how we can utilize those to help with compassion fatigue and burnout. Our leadership principles spell out ownership. And again, we think it's really important to think of the people we provide care to as our customer owners. And so this idea of ownership is really key. And then our learning objectives today. We want to define compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, and burnout. We're going to examine the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue and burnout. We're going to explain how engaging in the survival triangle can lead to compassion fatigue. And we want people to take tools away. We want people to have practical things that they can use. So we're going to develop a toolbox to help prevent or recover from compassion fatigue and burnout. Now we'll be referencing some specific tools while we're talking about developing that toolbox. And to find those tools today, what I'm going to ask you to do is go to this website, slides.nuka.com. Again, that's slides.nuka.com. It's going to ask for a conference code. The conference code is compassion, and the password is fatigue. Should be pretty easy to remember given today's topic. So again, slides.nuka.com, conference code compassion, password fatigue. And with that being said, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the housekeeping. our presentation today will be about an hour and a half in length. We're not going to take any breaks given that it's such a relatively short presentation. And if there's anything that comes up that we aren't able to answer, or that you want to just know more information about South Central Foundation or the Learning Institute or the NUCA system of care, you can email the Learning Institute at scflearninginstitute@scf.cc. I'm going to turn it over to KJ.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Gil. And to everybody, welcome. I saw names that I knew, and I'm glad you're all joining us. So let's talk a little bit about compassion satisfaction. It's really, these are some very, very simple terms, but man, are they ever important in terms of the quality of the lives that we have as providers. And so compassion satisfaction really refers to positive aspects of helping others. And Gil had talked about some of the tools that we're going to share during this conversation, and one of them is called the ProQual, and it's a self-survey that you can do that helps you look at where is your compassion satisfaction or your level of compassion fatigue. So I took a look at the ProQual before starting this seminar, and here's where I score in about high average in my compassion satisfaction. So I get a lot of reward in terms of the work that I do. Now, here's some of the ways that I know that. My ProQual says it reflects that I feel satisfied in the work that I do as a helper. It reflects that I get energy from keeping up with new ways of approaching care with our customer owners. And it says it reflects that I'm happy to do the work that I do. I found that statement really interesting because it's true, and there's a sort of ... to that. After being a clinician and a clinical supervisor, clinical director for 20 plus years, what I recognize is that the helping profession really has a cost to all of us who are in it. And with the foundation of Central Foundation having a strong emphasis on relationship, compassion satisfaction, issues of compassion fatigue, I think are particularly important to us within our system of care. So positive aspects are related to how we provide care, the system and how well the system is working, how we're working with our co-workers, and beliefs about ourselves.
So one of the questions we want to ask today is, what is your current need for compassion satisfaction? Knowing all the things we just talked about, what is your current need for compassion satisfaction? And again, you can go to menti.com, and the code is 805470. You can see we've asked this as a scaled question. You have no need for compassion satisfaction, low need, average need, above average, or high. And we're going to see what those results tell us about our audience today.
I will say that when I've assessed my need and really thought about it, my need has always been high. Yeah. Over the years, I've selected jobs primarily based upon how much it was likely that I would get that need of satisfaction back.
Right.
So it's worthwhile to appreciate how much we actually need or value that satisfaction of caring.
Absolutely.
Because there are some jobs where we're less likely to get that satisfaction of helping others met.
Right.
And that might be not so satisfying for me.
Right.
Yeah, and that can actually be a risk.
Well, and if we look at our score, our responses thus far, you can see that from the majority of our participants, it's above average, with average and high. Nobody has no need for compassion satisfaction. Nobody has a low need. It's all average or above, and that above average being particularly high. So that is really fascinating and not surprising at all.
Not a bit.
So we have another question for you. Given that you now know you've now identified what your need for compassion satisfaction is, we'll know currently how much is your need for compassion satisfaction being met. You say it's not being met at all. It's being met at a low level. There's an average, that's being met at an average level, at above average, or it's being met at a very high level. So again, using Menti.com 805470, currently how much is your need for compassion satisfaction being met? And let's go to the board and see what our responses are. So somewhat, adequately, okay.
You know, for me, Bob, I find this can happen episodically too, where
Sure.
I'm going through
And down.
work and then I may have some time with customers where I think, man, this is great. So it can be a little bit in flux throughout the week.
Yeah. Right now we've got a dead heat between somewhat and adequately, with somewhat taking the lead. Somebody's saying not at all. Their need for compassion satisfaction is not being met at all.
You know, I have to say, when most of the time at SCF, I would say I get more than adequate return on my satisfaction. I know that I'm having compassion fatigue when it starts going the other way.
Yes.
Right.
Because compassion fatigue can diminish our need of compassion satisfaction being met.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we saw that for most folks it was somewhat adequately or adequately that it was being met. We're going to talk some more now about compassion fatigue.
So I actually am making a bit of an assumption that most people have heard about compassion fatigue, and I'm just going to explain it just a little bit then. Compassion fatigue is a really important thing to be aware of in your life, and what it comes down to is these are the negative aspects of helping people. And the compassion fatigue can be related to different things. It can be related to the care that you provide, the type of work that you do. It can be related to the system that you're working in. Compassion fatigue can be related to the beliefs about yourself and how adequate you are doing or how well you're performing. And it can also relate to your own trauma as well as burnout. So compassion fatigue, if you think about it, is a place where providers can be tired, they feel less resilient. In many ways, there are lots of different components of compassion fatigue that relate to our physical, our emotional, and our spiritual well-being. So I know I've certainly talked to people who, when they are finished with a day of work, they go home and they don't have any give left. They are really physically tired and emotionally spent. Those are key indicators of compassion fatigue, and that's the time to really start to look at how is the work that I'm doing impacting me. You know, we talk about how important it is to really be aware, because we can also have this impacts us on an ongoing basis, and we may not know the level of impact because it can be kind of a slow and steady chipping away, or more and more, you know, you become less and less resilient over time. And sometimes that can happen so subtly that people can find themselves in a place of, holy smokes, I'm fried. And one of the things that I often think about with compassion fatigue and burnout is that idea of it's hard to come back when you're fully done. You know, it's so much easier to be aware of the cost that the work has on us. And, you know, I was thinking as we were talking about this earlier, when I went to school, the costs of being in this business were really never explained.
Yeah.
And we talked about self-care and how important it is to get a good night's sleep, but didn't talk about the emotional toll that goes on working with people who are at times in some of the worst spots of their life, who are feeling highly distressed and have suffered a lot of trauma. And compassion fatigue relates to sitting with our customers in that and feeling the pain that they feel. Mm-hmm. So
Yeah.
I think it's a true occupational hazard.
Absolutely.
Well, I might mention that we place a lot of emphasis on story, and in being in relationship with not only our customer owners, but with each other. And that when appropriate, and we want to be inviting of the relevant parts of someone's life and story. So in doing that, we are sometimes witnessing stories that can impact us, mm-hmm. and the emotions that might come with those stories. So we value that at SCF, which also perhaps increases our risk of compassion fatigue.
Very much so. And I love the way you brought in story. And I'm looking at these two definitions, primary traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress. Primary traumatic stress occurs when a traumatic event directly harms or threatens an individual, so it's to a person. Secondary traumatic stress is us learning about it, us sitting with that. And, you know, I've got an example that I wanted to share.
So primary traumatic stress, and I'm going to make it personal,
okay.
is mine as the caregiver.
Right.
So that I'm not bringing into my caregiving, but it actually can be there.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I was going to share a story about working with a customer who had often periods of suicidal ideation and repeatedly would end up being sent to API. And she had come into my office one time and was sharing with me that she was at a place where she was really at a low point, and she had decided that she was going to harm herself and had a very clear way of doing it, had strong ideation, intent, and plan, and it turned out that she had a weapon on her, that she was going to leave my office and go harm herself with the weapon. And that must have been 10 years ago. But I can still remember the fear that I had in that room at that time, trying to sort through all of the ways that I needed to work with her to keep her safe, and try and make sure that she didn't harm herself. But it definitely had an emotional impact on me. Sure. And that's one of those stories that
right.
continues to live with me as I move forward in care.
Yeah, another example would be how the different elements of compassion fatigue can impact us. One can be our history of primary traumatic stress to me, but it can also happen during the course of me caring for others, as in what happens when we call a code.
Yeah.
Sure.
That is stressful,
mm-hmm.
and that can actually be our primary traumatic stress,
mm-hmm.
in addition to being exposed to the suffering of someone else.
Well, I know you and I had been talking one time, Bob, about the idea of a stool, compassion fatigue as a stool having 3 legs. Mm-hmm. And the 3 components or legs of the stool are, as you mentioned just a moment ago, our own traumatic history, what has happened to us that can get triggered or impacts us because of the work that we do, then the work that we do and the trauma and the distress that we see with our customer owners. So all of the stuff that goes on day in and day out in a caring profession. And then the stress that we have as human beings in life with our families and our children and our finances and our health and well-being and mm-hmm. all of that. So those
Burnout.
3 pieces are very important. Yeah. So I think I'm going to introduce an idea here that talks to why we are so vulnerable as human beings to compassion fatigue, and especially for people who come into the business of helping others, being a care provider. I recently have been studying EMDR for working with people who have a history of trauma. And one of the things in the studying has really been a lot more awareness of how our brains function, how pieces of our brains are designed in such incredibly sophisticated ways, and that this concept of mirror neurons. So I recently learned how to scuba dive, and so I'm underwater and I'm seeing these fish in schools, and they're all moving with incredible precision connected to each other, but in a school. and in constant movement. And I realized that that's those mirror neurons at work, that one fish has it and the next fish is seeing it and picking up on the mirror neurons, knowing where it's going to move next, and the whole school is doing that. Well, we as humans have those mirror neurons as well, and that those mirror neurons are what allow us to connect to each other in an empathic way. We're hardwired to be able to have that connection. But that neurological phenomena is also, I think, what can contribute to our burnout if we are overly impacted by other people or not being able to have an appropriate boundary. But that's what allows us to feel
Empathy.
each other's pain and empathy. Exactly.
Wow.
That's how we have it. We're hardwired to have it.
Wow. Very cool.
Yeah, that those
I have lots of
neurons.
those neurons.
I know you do.
Yeah. Are they pointed back at myself?
So let's talk a little bit about burnout. Burnout, I think, really is that place where when you're getting close to being burnt toast, it's hard to come back to being a piece of bread. You know, oftentimes people or providers use the term, I'm crispy. Well, we might say that jokingly, but boy, that's a really important thing to be paying attention to, that it really is reflecting a number of these things. For me, the word that stands out in this slide is depletion. It is a depleted ability to respond in a happy, resilient, spiritual, healthy way to the tasks and challenges of the work that we do and the lives that we're living. That idea of loss of interest, decreased productivity, fatigue caused by overwork, that sense of I am emotionally, physically, spiritually drained. And that not only impacts us, it impacts the people that we are working with, it impacts the people that we are in love with, and it impacts the way that we feel about our lives and the quality of life that we live. This is why I think the concept and the conversation about compassion fatigue is so very important, because it has truly a personal cost to the way people are operating in the world as care providers.
I've got a question for the two of you. Do you think that it's easier to see burnout in someone else than it is to recognize it for ourselves?
For me, I think burnout, obviously it's a component of the stool, the three legs of
Right.
compassion fatigue. It is its own category, however, in that it can result just from the demands of life, childcare, schedules. My son and his wife just had twins. So every time I talk with him now, my son says, I really didn't know how burned out I could get. And they've only had these kids now for like weeks. So the demands of the situation, which is very different from our own trauma, the primary stress, and then the secondary exposure to other people's stress. So burnout's its own category. And usually I'll admit burnout. So back to your question, it's I know when I'm tired and I know when I'm fatigued. But if I don't ask, I may not know I'm actually suffering from compassion fatigue. I'm actually blaming on burnout.
Got it. Well, I think we think about compassion fatigue and especially the traumatic stress as kind of, and burnout being really connected.
Very much so. And I think I notice it in myself when my patience level gets lower. And I may also I think it's always easier to notice things in other people than it is to notice them in ourselves. We're much more aware of how other people are operating than really insightful into our own behavior.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, we've talked a lot about compassion fatigue. We've talked about burnout. And we've talked about secondary traumatic stress and kind of how those all show up. In some ways, I wonder if we can start really talking about, like, what does it look like? What does this look like for people?
Sure. I wanted to add one piece that is so important, and we'll talk about it more later, but I'm afraid I'm going to miss it if I don't mention it now. Think about Mother Teresa in Calcutta and the work that she did and how many nuns she brought into the Sisters of Charity. One of the things that she was absolutely mandatory about is having her sisters take mandatory periods of time off. That she recognized that the work was so demanding in so many ways that having a period of time to recover was absolutely what people needed to be able to continue to do their jobs effectively and with a loving heart. So some of the individual signs and symptoms, we've talked about increased negative arousal, maybe feeling much more easily frustrated or annoyed, difficulty separating work from personal life, easily frustrated and being able to carry some frustration actually home from work to into our life. Sleep disturbance. I know that that's one for me, that if I'm having difficulty falling asleep or if I'm waking up in the middle of the night, it's usually something to do with what's going on with me and how well am I.
I found that for a lot of people, sleep disturbance is kind of the canary in the coal mine for a lot of this. It's like that's maybe the first thing people notice, but it's like, oh, there's this context in which that's taking place.
Yeah, and I actually notice that I will have dreams about doing therapy where I will talk in my sleep and my husband lets me know what's going on. It's amazing. Dread of work or caregiving, depression or anxiety, and loss of meaning. Just feeling like, well, am I making a difference? What's the value of this? How am I positively impacting the world? All of those things being connected.
Well, and going through these, and I encourage everyone to try these on to see if it is one of their signs and symptoms. When we get to the one on dread, I keep coming back to the fact that I think it's one of the surest signs that I have compassion fatigue, because I really do love working with people, and I get a lot of satisfaction from it. And if I get a sense of dread about getting up and coming to work, or a sense of dread about going into that room with this individual, or hearing another story from a coworker, if I get that dread, that's a sure sign that my compassion fatigue has reached a pretty high level. So it's useful to know what your signs and symptoms are.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in a couple here because I think they're really true for me. Seeing the world as victims and perpetrators, and then also hypervigilance. I have a daughter, and I've spent a lot of time working with people who have been really harmed, and having kind of a skewed perspective of safety in the world, how safe is the world, and definitely more kind of on top of my daughter to make sure that she's always aware of what's going on in a way that if I had not had this career, I don't think I would be in any way having those kind of conversations with her. But that's a very powerful statement about how it's impacted me and how I see the world. And so I love that we're going to set up this kind of idea of victims and perpetrators, and that's a hugely important idea that we'll get to as this goes on. Mm-hmm. How about for you, Gil? I was curious, as your history of BHC, what did you find?
Sure. So certainly that I noticed just my energy level is decreased. I would find that I wouldn't have much left at the end of the day. Hypervigilance certainly, I think, is another one where it shows up for me. I think that feelings of career impotence, where you're just like, well, am I doing any good? I've certainly had those moments as well. So there's lots of these that certainly resonate from my experience working in a more clinical setting, and that when I've talked with other people in clinical roles, that they've identified as well?
You know,
I know one of my signs is I become more philosophical in sort of a negative way, as in what's the point? I'm paying attention more to the negative news and kind of chalking up evidence of, oh, well, things aren't going to change. I mean, I have even felt the same hopelessness of some of my customer owners, because I was engaged with them, I was feeling empathy for them, and then realized days later that I was actually still in the place that my customer owner was, feeling just as hopeless in my career. And I know lots of folks who have changed their careers, changed jobs because of compassion fatigue.
I think one of the most important points here is we have got to talk about it as providers.
Right.
I'm certainly aware that there are a number of people who just feel like you shouldn't be having these conversations because somehow if you can acknowledge that maybe there's some feeling like, am I making a difference? Or I feel frustrated and depressed if I'm working with someone, that maybe that means I'm not a good provider, or maybe that means I'm not doing my job right, or maybe that means I'm not effective. So I think the danger is not to recognize this and keep it away, and then again you can see how that trickles into that impact of, if I'm not paying attention to it and this stuff has a cumulative impact, I'm going to get slammed at some point.
You know, I might mention that something that I do, and I think I'm not alone, and because my need for compassion satisfaction is pretty high most of the time, I value that. So if I, let's say, get a load of compassion fatigue, exposure to other people's suffering, I've been empathically involved with people and our peers, and that it starts to diminish my ability to function as well, to be engaged as well. Well, I can't have that. So what I do, because I love my compassion satisfaction, I push harder and faster.
Right.
And actually I'll go above the performance. I might even add in another customer. I might even push harder and faster. And this is also a common thing with first responders who value themselves as having a certain personality to be able to respond that way. And if they get impacted with compassion fatigue, their performance might start to diminish a bit, and their mood, and they push harder and faster, and the tendency is to deny the compassion fatigue. So I think we all might have that, an element of it, until we know enough and have the knowledge about this to know our longevity and our enjoyment of life with family and work really requires us to manage the fatigue of caring for others.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, this doesn't just show up for individuals, this can show up for organizations as well.
Well, I always like that idea of what's happening on micro is happening on a macro. So if I was, let's just go from micro to macro, if I'm someone who is really at a high level of burnout, what am I doing? I might be calling in often. I might be underperforming or not following through in responsibilities I have to my team. I might not be making good decisions, or my creativity might be lowered, or my resistance to change. And all of those things also happen in an organization when it's fatigued. Yeah. So it is both here and there. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we've talked a bit about what are some of the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. We're curious about how this shows up for you. How would you know if you were being impacted by compassion fatigue? What are maybe physical signs, emotional signs, behavioral signs? So go to menti.com and using that code 805470, let us know. How would you know if you were being impacted by compassion fatigue? And we're going to look at what you have to say.
I'm curious about these scores.
Yeah, I'm very curious too. So I know that again, one of the things I didn't mention, but when I experience compassion fatigue, when I reach that level, my I get very cynical. So when my cynicism, and Bob, that's something I can join you in. My misanthropy gets a little more accentuated. I'm like, people, which is,
Yeah.
there's a reason I do this work. I love people, and so that's something that I really notice.
Yeah.
So people say they feel exhausted more often. Yes. Irritability, sleep issues, nightmares, physical illness, anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the physical illness is an important point. Boy,
Yeah.
does the stress how stress impacts our body and the toll, the emotional and the very physical toll that stress takes on us. What? I look forward to sleep.
Sleep before lunch.
Before lunchtime, yeah.
Yeah, that's just a tendency to shut down.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh God, I just can't wait to get home and go to bed, yeah.
Yeah.
Physical and mental signs, feeling tired, social
Yep.
withdrawal.
I love this.
I feel tired, have an inability to focus, frequent headaches and body aches. So again, now this shows up physically. Often tired, find myself complaining to colleagues, having a short
Yes.
fuse, customer owner is triggering you. That's a huge one. Questioning if you're right for the job. Anxiety.
Anxiety, right.
I snack more often and walk away from my desk more often.
True.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
looking for distractions. Yeah.
Yeah. Self-soothing behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. Those
Yeah.
self-soothing.
Drinking could be one. Eating.
Eating.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Twizzlers.
Oh, you are just going to make me admit that yesterday I had a lot of Twizzlers and a coffee crisp prior to this because I was feeling anxious,
Yeah.
and a little bit fatigued. So I use sugar to kind of
Yeah.
step up, power up with
Yeah,
sugar.
exactly.
One time in graduate school, we were videoing these sessions, right, so that we could get feedback. And so it was my turn to be videoed with this person. It was actually a real person at the university who was having problems. So I came out of the session and went in to be critiqued by everyone. And so everyone just like beaming at me, going, "How you doing, Bob? How do you feel?" And I was like, "Wow, what's the deal?" And so they said, "You have to watch the video." So I'm sitting with this guy who actually had back problems. And so he could only just sit like this. So over the course of my visit with him, little by little, became just like him. And when I was sitting in the room to be critiqued, my back hurt. I was bent over, and it hurt for most of the day. So I think we can actually resonate, and in our empathy and caring for others, we can actually mirror more than we realize that we do, and can cause all those symptoms, especially if it builds up over time.
Yeah.
And it's a great example of just how naturally it happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just lean into it. That's that.
Literally.
I'm hardwired to be connected to you.
Right.
I enjoy this slide. Who's at risk?
Everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Absolutely everybody.
It's true.
And as somebody once said to me, who is not at risk?
Rocks.
Rocks. Rocks are not at risk.
And I've said antisocial personality disordered folks, but I'm not even sure about that, really.
Yeah, so medical care providers, mental health.
Yeah, high
Law
risk.
enforcement,
Yeah, first responders.
first responders.
Family members.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe new parents.
True.
Yeah. Anyone with a chronically ill relative, I think that's key because we don't always think about
And the
that.
care,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
Right.
The toll of caring for someone with a chronic illness.
Yeah.
Okay. So, when we talk about all this, understanding risk factors are a very important component to being able to take care of yourself, being able to understand where you're at and what your risk could be. So your own history of trauma or loss. And just very briefly in my own story, I grew up in a way that ultimately I became someone who made things happen and took care of other people. So that history of mine is very much connected to one of my risk factors, which is overcaring, wanting to make sure everything's okay for everyone. Having low job satisfaction is a risk factor. If you're showing up to work every day and you're giving 110%, but boy, you're not feeling it internally. You're not going home feeling, man, I did great today. I did great work. I connected with people. That's a big risk factor. Having low compassion satisfaction, not getting satisfaction from what you do. A high need for compassion satisfaction, and then very much high exposure to the suffering of others. High exposure, and I think one of the things I'd add here is rapid, ongoing exposure to the suffering of others. You know, I was in a clinic the other day working with providers, and what became really apparent really quickly was how many significant traumas they were dealing with their customer owners, but they as providers had little time to just stop and feel it. It was just one and then another and then another. And at the end of the day, they go home with all of that. They haven't even been able to debrief as a small team. And so I think another risk factor is the rapidity of the stressors.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, because of what we've done over the years of responding to crises and responding across the state with critical incident stress management, we've had to learn about this. And because we wouldn't be here working if we didn't manage our compassion fatigue. Because of repeated, sometimes an incident in Barrow will happen, then another one in Iliamna, and then we love caring for folks and supporting people, and that repeated exposure in intense environments can actually be debilitating. Mm-hmm. And so I've actually had to sort of ride the wave of compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction and manage it on purpose. Mm-hmm. Because, and I know there's lots of folks who are, well, all of us really are at risk of it, and so we need to manage it and mm-hmm. pay attention to it as a real thing, because it's also a real thing that we probably are going to try to deny it or put it to the side and then just push harder and faster. So hopefully this presentation can be a little bit of a wake-up call to just stop and really appreciate this is a real risk mm-hmm. to our career longevity and to our compassion satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and I would add it's a real risk for the quality of our own lives.
Well, yeah.
And how we move in the world and how we operate with our family. It's just a very huge, has a big
it does.
Impact.
Right. Well, it can impact and negatively impact our physical, mm-hmm. mental, emotional, mm-hmm. and spiritual wellness. I mean, it really can.
Very much so.
So let's talk about some of the things we can do. What are some things we can do? And so we're going to spend some time looking at some of the tools we might be able to use, some of the practices that we might use, resistance, resilience, recovery, and then just some having information. That's the biggest tool that we really have in our toolbox, and ways that we can use information from, say, core concepts, mm-hmm. and then the survival triangle, which Bob is going to speak to, about how we can approach this.
Well, I think resistance. What is resistance all about? It's about self-care and self-knowledge. So this training, hopefully a first step in self-knowledge and self-awareness. I really encourage our audience to look at that ProQual tool that you've got access to. But self-care, self-knowledge, making sure that you're doing all the things that you know help you. So, for example, as providers, are we taking time to use our wellness leave? Are we exercising? Are we taking time to get our CEUs, or are we taking vacation? I mean, I'm definitely aware of people who have been so busy that they're not taking their time off, they're not taking their leave, or they're not taking CEU time because they feel so it's so important to be able to stay here and do the work. There really does need to be an awareness of balance about that. So one of the things that I like to do, and I've just started doing this, and I've shared this with you, Bob, I really recommend it, is I am trying to identify myself what a good day looks like. And it actually is a lot harder than you would think. So I'm keeping a list for myself of, well, what is a good day? And what I've come to is, at the end of the day, when I know I've had a good day, I know I've done some exercise. I've gotten up, I've made myself walk on the treadmill. I've been able to spend time with my daughter and my husband. I've been able to do something with my hands. But I have to make sure that what I think of as a good day, I'm actually spending my time in those areas. Otherwise, I can be coming home at night, sitting in front of the TV or picking up my book and zoning out. So for me, a big part of self-care is recognizing what is it that actually makes me feel satisfied, and am I living in accordance with those values?
I think of something that my wife and I have done related to going out to eat, because for the longest time we would end up in this place where we're going back and forth going, well, where do you want to go? Oh oh no, you decide. And then what it boiled down to is we couldn't think of what we wanted or where we wanted to go. So we would end up being frustrated and going somewhere neither of us really wanted to go. So we actually put a list on the back of one of the kitchen cabinets of the restaurants we like and the reason why we liked it. And so now when we have that conversation, and because of our stress or fatigue of the day, we can't really think of where we want to go, we open the door and we have a list of what has been satisfying. We could do the same thing about what works for us in managing stress and compassion fatigue, because it's not the same for everybody. As we kind of go through this, that might, do you know what your list is of what's works for you?
Great example. And then resilience. I think resilience is about overall living in accordance with the values that you have, recognizing that you are starting to feel depleted, identifying what you need to do to stay on track. If you're feeling like you are burned out or you have a high degree of compassion fatigue, making sure that you're sticking to your own principles and your own values, that you are mindful about not making big decisions at a period where you're feeling pretty depleted and pretty drained. I love the get organized and do one thing at a time. I know that I sometimes fall into I've got 30 things to do before the end of the day, and I let the 29 things that I'm actually not doing impact the one that I am in terms of how I'm feeling. I need to remember just focus on my one and then pick number 29 and number 28. Anything else you want to add there, Bob?
Well, I think gratitude is one of the best medicines we have. I know stay focused on the positives, one of the suggestions here, but actually utilizing gratitude as a medicine can really be wonderful and can change the dynamics and the stress of a home, to just actually be grateful for something or share with someone something about them that you're grateful for. So for me, that's one of ours in our family. It's like when we're all tense and overburdened and not enough time, we can always make time to be grateful for something, and it's very helpful.
One person I talked to talked about having a gratitude jar. And so if something really good happened that day, they'd write it down, they'd just rip a piece of paper off and put it in. And so over time, that jar just fills up. And on a day where things are a little less happy or satisfying, to be able to pick something up and be reminded of something that's also been impactful previously.
Love it.
And then recovery. I think first step of recovery is really admitting that this is an issue, that if you work in a helping profession, you're at risk. You likely have been impacted, and you need to be able to manage that and care for yourself. I think that sharing with other people, doing your own kind of therapy, finding someone that you can talk to that you feel comfortable with in a trustful relationship is key. And then also for major trauma, asking for a debrief and wanting to be able to have something that Bob or I could help with in terms of really being able to let something go that might be being held within a team.
We're getting better at SCF and NMC in knowing that the benefits of officially holding a debriefing, that's a name for, as a group in a semi-structured way, acknowledging the impact of an event. So, and then that can come from management, and so enough folks know about it at SCF and NMC and other places that if one of us asks for it, we certainly can look to see if the event fits, or if individual support is called for, or that perhaps a debriefing for a larger group of people would be helpful. It is available, and many managers know about it, but often they may not initiate it unless some of the staff actually ask for it. Mm-hmm. So we're getting better at making it now part of our culture, mm-hmm. that we know as an organization we admit compassion fatigue happens, and we are impacted sometimes with our own primary trauma because of our work, and there's something we can do about it as a group, as an organization. We have a way of acknowledging it in a way that helps lessen the impact, mm-hmm. and helps us move through it so we don't have to carry it with us into the next mm-hmm. trauma or loss. Mm-hmm. Oh. Well, I think now we're going to be entering some territory related to tools, what we can do about compassion fatigue. And as Gil said, our major tool, I think we all know this, the thing that makes any tool useful is information. So we bought my stepdaughter a skill saw 2 years ago for Christmas because she is one handy girl. She can build anything, and she's quite artistic. And so she's always building something, and she did it all with this, felt like a hand saw. She ended up with like a little cheap jigsaw, and so we thought, hey, we'll get her this circular skill saw to cut these boards. And so we were so pleased to show it up. Oh, so excited about having it, and never thought much more about it. Now it's been 2 years, and we just recently went down to help her with some project, and I said, well, where's the skill saw? And she said, oh, it's back at the house, and it's still in the Christmas wrapping. Why? And she said, I actually just didn't know how to use it. So all of the things that we've suggested about how we manage and the tools that we have available, and we've kind of categorized it in the 3 R's, right? Resistance, increasing our resiliency, and how to recover. Those are great tools, but a lot of times we don't use the tools even if we know about it. So this is especially true related to this thing we're going to discuss called survival triangle. And the survival triangle is actually a risk factor. But if we have knowledge about it, we can actually use it as a tool, an understanding. And some of the tools of core concepts, I think it would be helpful for us to actually get our hands on it like that skill saw, because most of us have learned about it. We may have some outside viewers that don't know about this, but we have a little bit of knowledge about, let's say, the ladder of inference. But how much after core concepts do we actually put the saw in our hand, learn how to plug it in, work with it a bit? so that we actually becomes a useful tool. So let's use this ladder of inference. As you know, Michelle presented this, and it's called the mental model. And so this is actually very common. I think we go through it. It makes total sense about how we take action in life. And this happens very quickly. We go up and down this sort of ladder all the time, where we gather data, the data of life, evidence, things we're getting, we're information. We add our own meaning to that information, and because we can't be doing that slow process of collecting data, taking notes. Life happens, things are moving, so we're just going to make assumptions and draw conclusions and then take action. So that's just how we move around in the world, and that model is going on all the time. I believe that, like that skill saw, let's take a little closer look at this, maybe put our hands on it and see if we can find something relevant. So we know we select data we treat as important. We add meaning and draw conclusions. This is effortless, fast, works routinely, and our conclusions before we take actions seem obvious to us. And most of the time it's efficient enough that we get through the day actually with some efficiency. So remember, assumptions is right up there above the collecting data and things like that. It would be useful to go into a little bit more detail about what assumptions are. Because for assumptions, and as you know, assumption, for it to be effective, really just sort of needs to just assume very quickly, something very, very fast. And most of the time, our assumptions are very helpful. I was actually thinking on the way in here this morning that, I got to work in maybe 15 minutes, but if I didn't assume that everyone would stop at stop signs or stop for a red light, I don't know how long it would have taken me to get to work, and maybe I wouldn't have gotten here at all. That assumption works most of the time, right? Most of the time that assumption is effective. So because that assumption is kicked in that people will pretty much stop at red lights and stop signs, I actually don't think about it much at all. So I just take action and move through. That assumption works pretty well. So for an assumption to work and be effective in our efficiency of getting through life very quickly, an assumption has the ability to delete irrelevant information. For instance, I didn't think about other people who didn't have a red light. I just came right to work. And I can distort the information so that it does fit. So there could be someone actually sort of rolling through their red light, but I assume that everyone's going to obey the law, and I have the right of way, so I may not even see that either. And so it becomes generalized, this assumption, and it can even be projected. An example of this would be in my life where I first rented a car that actually didn't have a key. It was after a long leg of a trip. I was exhausted. I was tired. I went and got my rental car, and this was in a location where there was nothing convenient. And so the guy fixed me up with paperwork. I got the key thing, and I noticed it didn't have a key, but I thought it was one of these where you push the button and the key pops out, right? So now I have to walk, like it seemed like a mile, to get to where mine was parked. I get in there, and there is no place to put the key. As a matter of fact, I can't find a way to get the key out. And so I thought, this is bogus. This doesn't work. So I walk back a mile, and ask the guy, what's going on here? And again, I'm just exhausted. And he says, oh, it's just a push button start. And so, great. So I walk back a mile. I get in the car again, and I'm pushing the button, and nothing's happened. unfortunately, I had to tell myself, I'll go back up there, and it doesn't work. The battery must be dead. And he said, did you put your foot on the brake? So, of course, but my assumption was, from all my years of driving, that things work a certain way. And if I had been less tired and paying attention, the things that I deleted, and if I'd gone down my ladder of inference and really gathered more data, I would have been able to figure it out. But my assumption was so strong about that key, I actually just immediately went to blaming the guy who checked me out. So appreciate, we all have assumptions. They're working all the time because we're going up and down that ladder all of the time. And if, however, we have an assumption, and because it works well most of the time, this assumption deletes information because it's not relevant to the assumption, distorts it so that it does fit the assumption, generalizes it so it's true all the time, and now because it's true all the time, I'll just project it to make this assumption come true. What if the assumption is wrong or totally off? So we know with the ladder, maybe we even know we're going to use the ladder. We're going to go down the ladder and gather more information like I did with the car, right? So, but the data I gathered was still within the assumption that someone screwed up. And so I go back up my ladder, I go take action with attitude toward that guy. And so we can keep going up and down the ladder, but if our assumption's really strong and it deletes, distorts, generalizes, and projects, I'm still going to keep doing this very same thing unless I get new information and know how to go down and have information now that gives me new data. So I think we've seen that. Another way we might be able to gather new data, and this is, of course, it seems a field here at the moment, but we're going to bring it back to compassion fatigue, that for us to gather more information, maybe even different information, to have perspective, we can actually use the core concept Cantor's four-player model. And let's use the concept of bystander. So we know this four-player model of move, follow, oppose, bystand is relevant to a well-functioning team. There's someone who's the mover, so the leader. We need someone to follow for us to be able to get anything done. We need somebody who provides correction and oppose. These are not just a team descriptions of how people behave in teams. We actually have these roles internally. So I'm going to ask you to access your bystander self and to, if you find that you're repeating the same thing atop your ladder, when you go back down the ladder to gather more information, let yourself assume the bystander role so that you can actually gather maybe even new information to have some perspective. So let's see, the survival triangle. This is going to be a concept I'm going to need some help with, and for you that are viewing this, I need some help to make this useful for you. We're going to go back down our ladders of how we manage ourselves in life, recognizing that all of us have assumptions. That's just how it is. Assumptions are great most of the time, but we actually we may have assumptions that are wrong. So how do we find out if they're wrong? So this example of survival triangle is one of the risk factors of compassion fatigue. It's a system and relationship that can actually function as a context. So things that we now have assumed are our actions may follow from something we aren't even aware of, and that's the context of something. Like, for an example, context can change the meaning about something. Like, is it legal to break into someone's cabin? Depends on the context, doesn't it? So if you're breaking in to steal something, that's not legal. If you are almost frozen and there's no cabins around except this one, you would never be prosecuted, and that would be perfectly fine to find shelter and survive. So this can actually operate at a level of context. This survival triangle, which we'll get into the details of in a moment. So let's just get there. Let's look at the diagram of this survival triangle for us to get an idea of how this relationship system gets formed. Now, I would like you to think about a situation of survival, of perhaps a traumatic incident, an experience. In that incident, it would be very easy to see that someone is harmed, and for us it might be us, and there's something or someone who's the harmer. So, and we would call that the persecutor, just to give it a label. And then if we're lucky, we have someone there to rescue. Let's see, it's a car accident or something. So we get victimized, we're harmed a bit, someone runs the red light. The assumption didn't work out this time. So we could say there's a harmer, a persecutor. Isn't it lovely to have the ambulance show up, EMTs come? Wow. Those roles become highlighted in survival situations, and they're in all of them. This is like there, and it's like easily imprinted for us to understand trauma that we may not even become fully aware of, but these roles can become an assumption and tied together during times of stress. Wouldn't it be lovely for our mind to be able to be prepared? So if we get into other times of stress, we might actually assume that there's going to be a persecutor, and there's a victim, and there's a rescuer. So we can actually internalize the system. That's in the diagram. The I and the E stand for internal, external. The arrows indicate, and the fact that the triangle is drawn upside down, instability. The triangle drawn upside down is a perfect example of instability because with the apex down, it doesn't take but a and that triangle falls over. Versus drawing it upside down with the base down, that's a universal symbol of stability. So this is not stable. And a person can move between these roles that very quickly, so back and forth. There's the role of avoidance and shutdown, and it matches and makes it easy for us to assume this system because of how the mind works. Here's an example. I am going to say a word, and what's the first word that comes to your mind? Win.
Ner.
I. Except for her. The rest of us would say lose. And if we do opposites most of the time, that's one of the first things that will come to mind is the opposite of it, right? Win, lose. Left, right. Up, down. That is a tendency of the mind. Now we have something of a system where those opposites are easily brought into importance. So if we have a harm, we feel harmed, well, there must be
a harmer.
And so if we're lucky and we feel harmed, we've got somebody who's helping. So all of us have been exposed to losses and traumas, and so for survival, these will become highlighted roles. And for some of us, we've had really serious trauma, and these roles become so dominant that there aren't really any others. So when that happens, remember how assumptions work. So deletion, distortion, generalization, and projection. A person can actually project that someone else is a persecutor just because if I'm feeling like a victim, what's my assumption with you, KJ?
That I'm harming you.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll save you, Bob.
There you go.
Nice to have a rescuer.
Exactly. So this is a highly likely system that is in healthcare. And many of us have grown up with this system in place in our families in subtle ways. I'm going to give some examples that are more extreme because this system can actually result in domestic violence. But for most of it, it doesn't reach that level. But when we get stressed and we're feeling harmed in some way, maybe even just personality-wise or emotionally something, it will make it very easy to assume that one of these other roles are there. Mm-hmm. And so, example would be this lady came in, and so I was just doing my job, and she just had a great session in terms of she did all the talking and described all this horrendous stress in her life and the traumas of the past. And at the end, she said, "Oh, Dr. Cheney, you're the best doctor ever." And so I felt actually kind of good. And second session was about the same thing. And third session, she came in and she needed $300 for rent. And just kept talking about that. I did as best I could to get her connected with resources. And then I could tell she just couldn't let go of that and kept perseverating on this, what she needed for her rent. And so I said, well, session's about over, so you can catch the bus. How about if we just call it early? And in that moment, she got this look on her face that was started to get angry, got more and more angry, and then she started cursing at me so loudly that people were running from in the PCC. And she started yelling, "You're the worst person ever. You're trying to hurt me. You got me to trust you. You're awful," cursing all the while. As she turned to leave, yelling loudly, she tossed her long-handled purse and just missed my face. And so I've been infected, I call it an infection, with this drama triangle that operates at a system that doesn't kick in all the time. But in that situation, this was stressful. And my assumptions related to this trauma kicked in. So since I was feeling like I was being victimized, what's my assumption about her?
She's persecuting.
I could have easily assumed she was persecuting me. Mm-hmm. And related to compassion fatigue, I could have easily taken it personally. Mm-hmm. I would have assumed that. So, however, another version of this could be like I could also start thinking, oh my gosh, I've harmed someone. I'm a terrible person. Because she's a victim, I would have also felt like a victim. And so another version would have been, wait, I've got $20 in my billfold. So I could have, I allowed this assumptive system of survival to kick in, I could have easily played the game because the assumption would have seemed true. And instead, I went down my ladder and I found the information there that luckily through my experience, I had some information there that was relevant for my bystander self, because I definitely did really kind of stop, enter my bystander self, gather data, and what was there? I was able to think survival trauma. And I didn't do any of those. And so in that moment, I'm pretty sure on my face, she could see compassion. Wow. I didn't take any of those roles personally. I didn't enter them. But I also knew she believed I was persecuting, that she was projecting it. And so I actually felt compassion. That feels a lot better than the fatigue and stress of wanting to hurt her, taking it personally, or going, oh my God, I'm a terrible doctor, or getting pulled into taking responsibility for her rent, being the rescuer. So this is a risk factor for compassion fatigue, because these roles can kick in without you even being aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so let's look at some other elements of this. We're going to lose the diagram, but I think you have it by now. The survival triangle is active when an individual views self and others only in those three major roles. Remember, there's the shutdown role as well. And sometimes in a family we'll try to solve this system where the members of the family move between rescuer, victim, persecutor. They're trying to solve it. Even when you think you're trying to fix it, if the system where these three roles are always together, you're going to get sucked into being a victim and back and forth. And so people will sometimes just shut down and go parallel. They don't engage. But it isn't a healthy one. It's numbing yourself out. And with repeated exposure, we internalize the system, and it can operate nonstop for some folks. Like for me and most of us, it may only kick in when we're exposed to someone carrying the system, or when we're highly stressed in some way, where our own survival assumptions kick in. And if for a survival assumption, for it to really be useful for survival, it needs to be reactive. It needs to be quick. So this does take some getting our hands on the skill saw, right? We have to kind of work with these concepts, which we don't have the space for in this presentation. So it does take some work to understand this. People can flip between roles very easily, and compassion fatigue and burnout from our relationships, if this element kicks in, this quality of assumptions kicks in, it'll affect our relationships. The system often results in relationships of high drama. I often call this system a drama triangle, because it actually feels like a soap opera. You move from one thing to the next. As caregivers, we're at risk of, like I did, of having someone, oh, you're the best thing, you're the best doctor ever, oh, thank you for those meds, and then they come back next week. I'm sorry, I can't give them to you. That was just enough for what you have. Oh, you're trying to kill me, you're trying to hurt me. You know how this flips. Front desk staff here at our clinics. You're able to fit them in a certain time. Oh, thank you. Our customer can feel like you're rescuing them. And then this particular time, you're not able to fit them in on that day. You're not giving me what I want. And what's my assumption if I'm infected with the survival triangle? The assumption is front desk person's doing this to me on purpose. So this is very alive and well, and information is the way to manage it, so that we can understand how it works. The system can be projected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see. It can result in us having a great deal more stress from our caregiving than necessary. So there is a system, a way of going down our ladder, gathering more information, and one of the pieces of information that's useful to have about yourself and about working with others is that there can actually be assumptions related to a system of survival that negatively impacts relationships. So with that, I think since we're running out of time, we better run forward.
All right.
One of the things that your sharing this has done in terms of our work together and my work is to ask myself, what role am I in?
There you go.
Yeah.
When I finish a session and if I'm feeling, I'm feeling frustrated or like I haven't done anything useful, I have to really detach and say, what role is this coming from, to try and get out of the triangle?
Yeah.
And let go of the role plus all of the emotion and the thinking that goes with it.
And that connects, KJ, for me, I think thinking that we probably all tend to gravitate towards particular roles or avoid particular roles. And that's something I'm actually curious about for our participants is, if the survival triangle is in play, which role do you tend to gravitate toward? The rescuer, the victim, the persecutor, or do you just shut down and avoid? So maybe we can find that out from folks. And using Menti.com, what is the role that you tend to gravitate toward when you're in the survival triangle? So one person says shut down. Yeah, I think my hunch is that when you have reached a threshold for compassion fatigue and burnout, that probably becomes a more common one.
Shut down or persecutor.
Or persecuted, yeah. So shut down. I know I tend to gravitate towards the rescuer role. How can I fix this? How can I take care of you?
That's true.
You can also see the system as a perpetrator.
Right.
So working with a young man over at Covenant House, he's about to age out. The system, well, what's going to happen to this young guy? He's 18 years, he's coming on 18 years old, he won't have any place to go, very little resources. So who's the persecutor there? Kind of the system, there's nothing available.
So, and going home, sometimes our professional role will protect us to some extent, and so we'll get impacted by this survival triangle and pick up stress from it, take it personally, maybe even feel like we've been victimized by work, and now when we go home, I don't want to be a victim anymore. So, but I do feel that way. Now I might easily blame my partner as the persecutor, and actually say it out loud. Now I'm yelling back. At work I didn't, except my left-hand column, another one of those tools, can sometimes tell us which role we're in.
So I think it's really interesting that we see that vast majority of people gravitate towards the rescuer role, and then shut down. We don't have any persecutors or victims in this.
Right.
So I find that really interesting, and not surprising at all.
Right.
Not surprising at all. We also tend to avoid certain roles. So when you are in a survival triangle, if that's at play, which role do you tend to avoid? Now others might try to put you in a particular role, but which role do you avoid? And again, thinking about that and using Menti.com 805-470, which role do you avoid in the survival triangle? I'm curious to see those. I have some theories.
I avoid the persecutor role.
Yeah. People are avoiding that. People are avoiding the victim role, the shutdown role. I avoid the persecutor role as well. I don't want somebody to feel that I've injured them in some way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we want to talk about, and as we start to close out, and I realize we're going over ever so slightly today, but we had a lot of good information to share with you today. We want to talk about what are the tools, the practical takeaway tools that you can use for prevention and recovery from compassion fatigue and burnout. Well, hopefully some of the information that you've learned today, the information that you've learned about the survival triangle, and some of the ways that we can apply core concepts tools and thinking about resistance, resilience, and recovery. Some of the resources that are available on MediaSite or through that slides.nuka.com using the conference code compassion and password fatigue. We have something that we've referenced several times, this professional quality of life scale, which do one of you want to speak to that a little bit more, just what that is?
It is a pencil and paper self-survey that helps you look at what's my level of compassion satisfaction, what's my level of compassion fatigue, what symptoms do I have perhaps of burnout. And the value of the tool is being able to, once you complete it, it gives you information about where to put your attention, because it highlights for you places that you are vulnerable in.
Yeah, yeah. Also on that one of the tools that we have available on there is a symptom checklist that looks at the symptoms of compassion fatigue and trauma, vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. Those are things where you're just looking at that and saying, where am I on this? Are there things that are showing up for me? Sometimes being able to put a name to that and identify it can be very helpful. So those are both available on there for you. We also have, really starting to think about what are your warning signs for compassion fatigue, and using that checklist could be helpful there. Making sure you're checking in regularly with your peers, your supervisors, your manager. I know I was sharing with KJ yesterday, one of the things that I really appreciated when I was in a clinical role is having people that, when I started to reach that threshold, or I had a particularly challenging situation that I was dealing with, going and just talking with somebody.
Very much so.
Yeah. And using some of those resiliency strategies, yoga, meditation, breathing exercises, physical activity. If you're an employee here at SCF, we have quite a few of these with yoga and meditation and Tai Chi. There are resources that are available through our wellness center that you can actually participate in these and use your wellness leave to take advantage of. That's another tool that we have in our toolbox that we don't have listed here.
I'm going to just add, you talked about going and talking to someone. I think being mindful about who that is, and a really good piece of advice I got at one point was make sure it's someone you know is going to give you true feedback too, not just confirm your frustration or your whatever is going on, whether you're in a place of being a victim, but to give you some real clear-eyed perspective.
Yeah.
And do remember that we do have a ladder, and that a useful strategy is to come back down your ladder related to whatever is the stressful situation. One of the questions to sit with as the bystander once you're getting down there, getting some information, is my reaction based upon an assumption.
Yes.
And remember, assumptions work because assumptions delete, distort, generalizes, and it can project. So to be able to be willing to investigate whether and ask, is this assumption really true?
Yeah.
Or not? Or is there more information or data that I need to collect?
Yeah.
Great.
Utilizing your employee assistance program. Most organizations, we certainly here at SCF have one, most organizations do these days, but the employee assistance program is a resource where you can actually go and talk with someone at no cost to you to help process whatever trauma or stress and it doesn't have to be work related either. It could be anything that you want to talk about. So if you're an SCF employee, ask your manager or supervisor for information about our employee assistance program. If you're not an SCF employee, ask about your organization's employee assistance program. That's a fantastic resource and tool. It's one that I've used in the past myself and found very helpful. And then one of the documents that's you're able to download is your own personal prevention and recovery toolbox, where you can actually start listing out, these are the things that I can use. So what I'd like to ask now is for everybody just to identify what's one tool that either you do use or that you will use in your personal prevention and recovery toolbox. And maybe I'll start by asking Bob and KJ, what's one tool that you have in your prevention and recovery toolbox?
I have an app on my cell phone, and it's a gratitude journal. And so it just, whatever date I open it up, I can write what it is in there, and then I can also add pictures to it, photographs to it. So going home last night, I got a great picture of a moose. That's part of the gratitude journal.
Okay, great.
Small things.
Great.
Oh, I have lots of them. Probably the most important is sharing with someone who I know understands compassion fatigue and the need for me to actually kind of express some things. I'll choose someone who I know will not judge me because they also recognize compassion fatigue is a real thing, and one of the ways to deal with it is get it out and express it. So that's one of the main things.
Yeah, yeah. So I love the things
Yeah.
we're getting listed. We have yoga, hiking, walks and talks with coworkers. I appreciate that too. Hanging out with friends and seeing Dr. Bob. Yes.
Yes.
Singing. I love that. Music as self-therapy. I am a firm proponent of that. Yoga and physical activity again. Exercise. So you see a lot of different things here. There's lots of different ways that we can take care of ourselves and use lots of different tools. And hopefully you've learned some new tools today that'll be of benefit to you. And I want to ask if there's any particular questions right now. Feel free to send those to me via media site. You can always send those to us through the Learning Institute as well. If there's something that was left unanswered or that you want more information on, please feel free to follow up with us about that. This webinar is available online. Once it's been recorded, it will be put into our library of webinars that you can watch at any time. And we will have more live webinars coming up in the future, but we have a whole catalog now of on-demand webinars on this topic and many more. You can go to scfnuka.com/trainings/webinar and find this one, information about this one and others. You can also find information about other training opportunities through SCF and the Learning Institute about the NUCA system of care. I encourage you, if you have questions about anything that we've discussed today, don't hesitate to reach out, and you can do so through the scfnuka.com website. Bob, KJ, anything else that you would like to add at this point?
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, exactly. We're recording this on Halloween, so I'm dressed as Bob, and Bob is dressed as me.
Yeah, I'm going as the scariest thing I could think of.
Which is me, all right. So we really thank you for joining us today. We hope that you've learned something that's going to be helpful to you and that you can apply to your own management of compassion fatigue and burnout. It affects all of us. It's affected each one of us on the stage, and that's why we think it's important to talk about it. So again, we really thank you for joining us. We hope you have a pleasant day. Till next time, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.